Go ahead and turn to Exodus chapter 34. And while you're turning, as Thanksgiving approaches on Thursday, I can tell you what I'm going to be thankful for. I'm going to be thankful for school teachers. Yes, amen is right. We have no idea. The next time you complain about our present system and school teachers in our system, just go into your restroom, look in the mirror, and just pretend Pastor Rick has just slapped you in the face for saying something so stupid. Because, after how many weeks have been doing this? Not that long. Those 7th and 8th graders, they want to tell you, they're wearing me out. I was ready for 3 o'clock on Friday. I have substitutes for the substitute on Thursday. And I'm filling in, coming up with lesson plans, signing work, I grade papers, everything that a teacher does. And so I leave plans for the substitute. This week I had a retired Marine was my substitute teacher. And he leaves me a note. And basically it goes like this. He says, first, second, third periods were disrespectful. They were disorganized. They were misbehaved. He just went on and on and on and on. Apparently, he told the kids that they ought to be ashamed of themselves. And he says, but fourth period was pretty well behaved by comparison. And then he wrote a list of all the kids that he wrote up. So Friday starts out, I read them all the riot act. I chew out the first 3 periods and tell the 4th period, got a good report on you, but every one of them was, it was just annoying. It's probably because it's getting close to Thanksgiving. And so these kids are misbehaving. I wrote up 7 myself on Friday. I was so thankful for 3 o'clock to come around. It was ridiculous. But to tell you how much of a challenge it is, on Thursday when we had the men's Revelation class back there, I was tempted to apologize to the guys and say to them, if I start to treat you like a 7th or 8th grader, just remember it's hard for me to take the switch off. But thankfully the guys in class don't talk through class. Some of you do talk through class, so I might say, so-and-so, do you want to get written up? So, yeah. If I do that, just remember where it's coming from. I will be thankful for school teachers on Thursday and praying a blessing on them like you wouldn't believe. Exodus chapter 34. This is an interesting passage because I think it's a great passage for our observance of Thanksgiving. We're going to get into the historical aspect from an American point of view. But look at what God directs the Jewish people to do all those many centuries, millennia ago. 6 days you shall work. But on the 7th day you shall do what? Rest. By the way, I've heard all kinds of teaching on Sabbath rest. Jesus is our Sabbath rest. You can go out and you can play. You can do all this stuff on Sundays. And the Sabbath, yes, for the Jewish people was from sundown Friday until sundown Saturday. Ours is on Sunday. But there is an aspect that the human being is wired for that 7th day of rest, but also of worship. We're made for that. It's designed in us by God. And so it's not just a command, it's something that He plugged into our very core of our being. So that's the command. In plowing time and in harvest you shall rest. And in verse 22, you all shall observe the Feast of Weeks, which is their version of Thanksgiving. You shall observe the Feast of Weeks, the first fruits of wheat harvest, and the Feast of Ingathering at the year's end. Got it? By the way, as I told folks earlier, this is the last day of the Christian calendar for a liturgical church. It's for us, it is a fulfillment of this. It's the year's end. We're approaching Thursday as Thanksgiving, but there's a historical reason behind it. That, the first American Thanksgiving, and I find most of us don't understand it. We don't understand the history. We've kind of forgotten it. We may have clipped out little pieces of paper with our kids or our grandkids, and put them on a flannel board or something like that. We've got some sort of idealistic or idealized idea of what that first Thanksgiving looked like. But before we get there, before we talk about that historical aspect, I just want to read for you Philippians chapter 4. I think it's crucial to this story. Hold on to it as we talk about that first Thanksgiving. Do not be anxious about anything. This was one of our key verses last week. But in everything, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. So here's our lesson from history. If you take and you look up, let's put the map up. The first Thanksgiving was 1621. And it was in the fall of 1621, probably anywhere from September to November, but closer to September to October. But it started years earlier, and it didn't start in the United States. It started actually in England. And there was a group of people from Scrooby. You see that little town up there in the northern part, just above Boston and London. But up there in that northern part, Scrooby, what an interesting name. Scrooby-Doo, where are you? So they're there, and they're separatists. They're Puritan separatists. They don't agree with the Church of England. They don't think the Church of England has gone far enough in the Reformation. They want to change things. They think there's much more to do, because the Church of England looked a lot too much like the Roman Catholic Church. And they had real problems with that in worship style, and they just had challenges that they believed both to be corrupt. And so they leave England, because in England, if you were going to be a citizen of England, you were also a member of the Church of England by law. And you even to leave, you had to announce and get dispensation to leave the Church of England. They end up doing that by 1620 when they leave. But I mean, it's a big-time process. Both church and state are intertwined, which is really where our history comes from. It's the separation of church and state. By the way, it is to protect the church from the state, not to protect the state from the church. That was the original intention. Because of this is the model that Europe had. And so they leave and they go over to Amsterdam, and they're there in 1608. They go there. They're in Amsterdam initially, and it's hard for them to get a good start. The Dutch would not recognize them in their guilds. They ended up with very menial jobs, even though there were some highly skilled craftsmen. They then moved to Leiden, which is just below Amsterdam. They moved to Leiden, and they lived there for about 10 years. And things just gets rough for them. Their kids are starting to follow a lot of the norms of the culture. They're starting to be lured away from the church. And this culture was not very, by today's standards, they were probably pretty uptight. But by their standards, by the Puritan standards, this was a hedonistic bunch of people. They did just about anything and everything. And this was in the 1600s. So the separatists had a real problem with it, and they decided they were going to go to the New World. So then they moved back to England and go back to England, and that's where the Mayflower story starts. But did you realize there were actually two ships? Did you know there were two? There were two ships. One of them was called the Speedwell, and it wasn't very speedy, and it didn't float very well. Because as they take off, it started to leak. I'm not saying criminal sort of behavior has been around for a long time, but the criminal behavior was around for a long time. And there were some people that were probably just really good at taking their money. And so they had all paid big bucks to escape England. And they did petition to leave England and leave the Church of England. And they were granted permission. The king did, James I, did say to them, he said, but you have to behave well. If you're going to go to the New World, you have to behave yourselves well. So about 40, we don't know the exact number, some number at 41, some number just 40, but about 40 of these Puritans, along with some outsiders, got on these two ships, and the Speedwell starts to sink. They go back to port, they all pile onto the Mayflower, and so there's the Mayflower, or reproduction of it. Do you want to know how small it is?
It's pretty small.
You can put 3 of them in here.
Okay, that's pretty small.
3 of them in this room, side by side. And actually, the room is too long. It would stop well before my office door. Now next screen. And see the 5 and 6 there in the middle, that middle deck down at the bottom is where they stored everything. That's the Mayflower, and in that little section of 5 and 6, 102 people lived for 66 days, crossing the waters. Isn't that amazing? I mean, that's amazing. Now, that's not counting the crew. So they get to the New World, but the problem was that Speedwell little bump was more than just a little bump. The Speedwell bump delayed their leaving. And so they ended up leaving during the stormy season. And they get to the New World, and they're supposed to be between the 38th and 41st parallel. They actually landed about the 42nd parallel. It doesn't sound like much, but there's a big difference in temperature. Right, that's Yankee territory for those of you who don't understand that. I mean, it's cold, it's nasty, and winters are tough. And they get there, and they decide to make a go of it anyway, even though they're in the wrong spot for the charter that they're at. And they land there, and guess what they did? They lived on the ship for the winter. Was that a good choice or a bad choice? Please say bad. It was a real bad choice. They went back and forth, and this area that they stopped at was apparently pretty fetid. It's kind of almost like a swampy area where the boat docked. And they would run out to the boat back and forth to land. And as a consequence, in that first winter, they dropped from 102 passengers to only 53, and half the crew died. Out of 19 women, only 5 women survived, and 4 of those were married women. There were a number of kids that passed away, infants that passed away, and I urge you, I'm a history buff, so I love it. It's interesting I'm teaching math, because I'd much rather teach history. But you should go back and read some of the original accounts written by these people, because it's pretty interesting. It's actually, if you like the Marvel comics at the movies, let me give you something that's going to be far more fun to read, and just read some of these accounts. It'll enlighten you. And they get there, and they get off that boat, and half their number dies. And then they start to make a go of it. The ship, the Mayflower, does finally leave in 1621, and it goes back to England. But they've gone through this horrible trip. And one of the seamen, by the way, was lost overboard. He got washed overboard during one of the storms. An infant died. And then they had this sickness throughout the winter. They claimed half their number. And then they start to farm. Do you think that was easy? No, it wasn't easy at all. I mean, it was a pretty tough time. Let's look at this next screen. That's probably a pretty good rendering. of what that first colony looked like. And I'm thinking, though, that the houses were nothing like what we're used to. If they're thinking they can get into a ship, 102 of them, that went from about here to that wall in width, and from here back to maybe the middle of the double doors, what do you think their homes look like? About that big compared to ours. I mean, really small. Made out of the timbers. I'm guessing most of them would have had something like dirt floors if they were very, very poor. They would have tried their best, but remember, weather was one of the things that they fought all the time in those early days. And what about things like heat, air conditioning? You know, all those things that we take for granted, they didn't have. Oh, and I thought of this illustration. Remember I told you how many of them passed away? We just don't think about how just a few years difference makes a big change in the way you do things. Can you imagine? Hey, how you doing? Right? That would have been normal back then. Talk about nasty sort of just passing on of germs and things like refrigeration and I mean stuff we just take for granted nowadays. They didn't, and they thought they were advanced. Can you imagine what people are going to think of us in 400 years? And boy, talk about those primitives. Next screen. I mean, look. Pretty, isn't it? But anybody, I did do this in Georgia one time, and I found out that we had some people that grew up in a shack in Georgia. It was a couple of gals in our church, and they talked about how the walls were so thin that they remember their parents putting up cardboard and newspaper, and that was their insulator for the wind. And that's probably what the inside of these were like, just these open gaps in the timbers. Next year. Next year. Oh, there it is. Why do I say that? Or why even this whole story? You know, when they emerged and farmed, and by the way, they did not get the crop they were hoping to get. If it had not been for the Native Americans who came and helped them, they would have starved, literally. And they showed them some farming techniques that helped them out quite a bit. Remember the famous Squanto story? And I mean, it helped. But here's this ragtag group of people. They're probably this big compared to what they were in England, that big. And they emerge, and can you imagine what was going through their minds? Yes, Lord, I'm thankful that my wife died in my arms this winter. Lord, I'm the only survivor in my family. I'm an orphan now. And these strangers, these people that I've known now for a year, they're here to care for me. What's going to become of me? And by the way, I'm female. And my future is pretty uncertain as a female. The Mayflower Compact was signed by 41 men. Because women did not have the rights that we take for granted today. So can you imagine what goes into that thinking? And so here's what I think we can learn from these predecessors and from what Scripture teaches us and taught them. And that is faith. Well, faith does require a step. As I shared with the adult Bible study this morning, that idea of pistis, it's not just belief, it's literally putting action behind your belief. And they did. I still cannot comprehend getting on a wooden ship that's pushed around by wind And if it's only this big, can you imagine what those waves look like in the middle of the ocean? Yeah, it would have been crazy. And I'm going to trust my life to you, God. And we're going to go to they talked about the New World, but this was like something out of a science fiction novel as far as what we now know as the United States. America was just this strange land that they had heard about, and these Native Americans that were living here. But it was like a Edgar Rice Burroughs sort of novel. It was incredible. Well, Lord, I'm going to trust you. I think you're calling me to do something, and I'm going to trust you to do it. That's pretty enormous. What sort of fears have kept you from doing things that God has led your heart and mind to do? What I find is most of the time we say no, and all that's waiting for us is a huge blessing just to follow God and trust Him. And now look at us, by the way. They're our predecessors, but is this a pretty good place to live? Yeah, it doesn't look anything like what they had. But if it hadn't been for them doing that step of faith, we wouldn't have what we have today, true? It's true, true. Good. Number 2. Recognize when culture is a threat. They didn't like the culture in England. They knew it was a threat to their faith. They go to Amsterdam, they get over there, and they find the same thing, even worse. So they said, Lord, are you guiding us someplace else? We've got to go someplace where we can worship you and not have culture threaten us. Their very children were being taken from them, not by people coming into their homes and snatching the children out of the home, but by nothing more than ideas. And those ideas were taking their children from them. We have the same problem today. I was talking to Cease, tells her stories. I was talking to Cease on Thursday, and she was talking about one of her grandchildren. Solid in youth groups, solid in everything, goes off to university and turns their back on their faith. Won't have anything to do with it, won't teach his children anything about the Bible. Says, no, I'll let them make their own choices, which all sounds high and good and kind of noble in some ways. But when you leave a child adrift, what happens? They get lost, they drift. We need to recognize that our culture is a threat to us and know when to put the barriers up so that it doesn't intrude on us. And by the way, just in my short time in ministry, I can tell a difference between our culture just a few years ago and our culture today within the church. Because culture, and Satan uses culture, is stealing all of this from us. Don't be afraid to be bold. Really, don't be afraid to take big risks. Do big things for God. I think I'm a living testimony to that. I've known other people who've done it. It's not like I was original, but I left the business world and went into ministry. I make far less money now than I did then, but I'm far happier. And we've got far more. And we do far more things. I'm going to try and take as much of this paycheck that I'm getting from teaching these kids at school, I'm going to turn it right back into somebody's life. Take one of those kids shopping and put new clothes on me. The little boy that I talked about this past Sunday, who broke my heart, well, he's the one. So I just asked him, give me a 7th or 8th grade. This little guy is the one who I'm getting to try and help. And I've seen him wear the same outfit every day I've been there. The same outfit every day. And I don't know if this is his story, but I did hear there's 2 of these kids that mom and dad are in jail or gone or whatever, grandma is taken care of, but she doesn't like their behavior, so when they misbehave, she puts them in a car out in their driveway. And that's where they sleep at night. I mean, there's kids around here that have tough lives. And so be bold. We've got plenty of people telling us, this is what you ought to do with your money, and this is how you ought to spend your taxes and all that stuff. I'll tell you what, I'll follow the first person who shows me they take their millions, sell everything that they have, and give it away to the poor. I'll believe that person. But if you're going to tell me what somebody else needs to do, I'm not going to be bold. So give thanks, by the way, every time. So make sure that you, no matter what, give thanks. And here they are, they wake up from this horrible year and a half. And then they invite the natives in. And the natives at that first Thanksgiving outnumbered them 2-1. Those are probably pretty scary people. They walk around and they probably comb their hair with bear grease. I'm sure they didn't smell that well. And I'm sure just about as different can be. But first thing they did was help out with that first Thanksgiving. They killed a number of deer and they roasted up some deer, and that was most of their protein. They might have had turkeys, but we don't know for sure. But that was a strange time, wasn't it? And what they had yielded out of that first crop was pretty minimal. And the first thing they did at the end of harvest, God, I just want to thank you. Now that's bold. And that's pretty faithful. And that fulfills this, one of my favorite passages. Rejoice everlasting. I'm sorry, I memorized it in New American Standard. Be joyful all things. Pray continually. Pray without ceasing. In all things give thanks. Give thanks in all circumstances. For this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus. And I've had to correct people's thinking on this. It's not saying what happens to you is God's will in all things. But the fact that you give thanks is God's will. He wants us to be thankful. So, here's where we end up. It's Thanksgiving. Maybe this year didn't turn out too well for you. Maybe it could have been better. Maybe things aren't going well right now. Maybe you're struggling with a few things. But if your ancestors could get off of the boat and walk through cold, icy water, and half of their number died, and then they go through a bad crop and a bad harvest, and then they decide to have a party and they invite the local neighbors, and the neighbors are really weird. And they still give thanks. Maybe you could too. Father, I just give you thanks. I pray in Jesus' name that we are more thankful for what we have. Father, may thanksgiving and praise be so much a part of each and every one of us that it never occurs to us to not give thanks. Rather, Father, may this story and just our history as a people remind us of what a great God you are and what a great giver you are. And just be very, very thankful for the blessings that you've bestowed upon us. We give you thanks this day and in the days that follow. In Jesus' name, amen.